Most of us think that our food preferences just depend on how food tastes. But today I'm going over research that shows that what happens after we eat might actually be more important for determining what tastes good to us and what we crave. And these effects have really important implications for managing our weight and determining what we choose to eat. Hey there, I'm Mish, and I am a full-time researcher with my PhD, and by day I conduct and publish studies of my own, whereas by night I share the results of other people's studies here to help you reach your weight loss, fitness, health, and nutrition goals. Today's video will be a combination of cool science that I'm pretty confident you've never heard before, as well as some very practical advice for how you can apply this information to help you reach your healthy eating goals or your weight loss goals. And for a sneak peek, the effects I will be talking about today have some major implications for why our body reacts differently to processed foods and why our cravings go haywire with processed foods, as well as how our cravings develop over time and how we might be able to get ourselves to crave more healthy foods. So stick around till the end to hear all this practical advice. For some background, it's thought that the reason that we crave foods and why some foods taste good is that foods that taste good are foods that we have been conditioned to expect to provide something that our body wants. So for example, something that tastes fatty is much more likely to have a lot of calories, which in terms of our body's opinion, that's generally a very good thing. And we crave sugary things because they contain, again, calories, as well as quickly available energy and the ability to replenish muscle glycogen. On the other hand, foods that taste bad, especially universally to humans in general, are generally foods that are poisonous. So we've evolved to crave things that give us things that we want for our survival and think that things taste bad when they are not supposed to be eaten. But if foods don't have the effects that we predict they should have, then things can get weird. For example, pretty much everyone doesn't like the taste of coffee when they're a kid. But over time, once you start having coffee because of social norms, you start to actually develop a love for it in general. So most people end up loving the taste of coffee, even though originally it tasted bitter and terrible. And people say, oh, that's just because of growing up. But what's really happening here, according to studies, is that you learn to associate the flavor of coffee with the good effects it has on you after you eat. So if you had decaf coffee and that's it for your whole life, you probably would not start craving it and you probably would not enjoy the flavor. But because coffee has caffeine and has good effects on you and how you feel and how you function, therefore you start to associate coffee with good things, and therefore coffee actually starts to taste better. And if you don't believe me, there is a crazy study that gave people fruit juice, and for half of people, they put caffeine in this fruit juice, and people did not realize that it was caffeinated. Whereas for the other half of people, they just left the fruit juice as is with no caffeine. And over the course of 4 sessions, they found that people who had the caffeinated fruit juice just kept liking it more and more. So their ratings of its actual flavor, so how good it tasted, increased over time as they kept having it when it was caffeinated. On the other hand, for the fruit juice that was not caffeinated, people rated it as tasting slightly worse over time, so they got kind of tired of it. So what this shows us, along with a ton of other studies finding these same kinds of things, is that what happens after we eat a food or drink something ends up being really important for how much we actually enjoy the flavor of the thing later on, because it becomes conditioned. And this could be one reason why people say that Starbucks tastes good, because I think it tastes terrible, but it's really, really caffeinated. And for me, getting that much caffeine feels terrible, and I really hate how Starbucks tastes. Whereas people who need all that caffeine tend to love Starbucks. And it gets even crazier because other studies in rats, because we can't do this in humans, have found that if you pair a disgusting flavor that rats hate with an infusion of glucose to their liver, so literally direct main line of sugar into their body, not from the food, those rats will actually start to crave the bitter food that predicts getting that glucose infusion. So you actually start craving things that have effects on you after eating them, if they are good effects, even if they're not directly from the food. And this kind of conditioning also affects how our bodies respond to foods before we eat them. So for example, if you're about to drink a soda or you are thinking about drinking a soda, you will start to release insulin in preparation for that infusion of sugar into your body. But if you then have a diet soda without sugar, you will get hypoglycemia or low blood sugar just a little bit from this insulin release not having any sugar to store in your cells. And so what happens over repeated times where you drink diet soda is that you will start to release less insulin as a result of expecting soda. So your body learns to change how it responds to food both before and in terms of how it craves food based on what the food actually does to you after eating. And all these effects I've been telling you about in terms of how food affects your body after you eat it are called post-ingestive effects. And one of the big reasons that these kinds of post-ingestive effects could be really important for our own lives is that when we get exposed to a lot of foods that taste identical but have very different underlying compositions, like I was just talking about with soda. So you could have 2 potato chips that taste exactly the same, but one of them could be really high in oil and way higher calorie than the other one. But because we can't really taste a huge difference there, it becomes very difficult for our bodies to learn how to map taste onto energy density and underlying nutrient composition. And one of the most prevalent examples of this type of issue is with artificial sweeteners, and also foods that are artificially made to be really low fat. So for example, diet soda versus normal soda, as well as low-fat milk or non-fat milk versus high-fat milk, because these things taste very similar, but vary drastically in the actual content of the food, so how much fat or sugar they contain, and therefore the effects that they end up having on our body after eating. On the other hand, in nature, the taste of foods tends to really predictively map onto what those foods contain. So for example, starchy foods like potatoes and grains taste starchy, and they have starchy effects on our bodies, and they're pretty unsurprising. If you taste a starchy flavor from a whole unprocessed food that hasn't been combined with other stuff, you can bet very confidently that that food contains starch and not much else. And similarly, foods that taste fatty in nature are going to be the fat-containing foods. You are not going to get confused. And same thing with sugar. If you eat something that tastes sweet, then it's probably fruit for the most part, or some vegetables, and it will in fact predict that you are getting mostly glucose and not this really confusing combination of things generally. But nowadays, because we are constantly combining sugar and fat in like a million different ways, especially in processed food, there's no longer a clear taste signal that says, okay, because something tastes like this, it's probably going to contain X amount of fat and X amount of sugar. It is all over the place, depending on what bakery you go to, or if you're drinking diet soda or normal soda, or whether the pastry used full-fat milk or low-fat milk, or whether the candy has fat in their caramel, or if it's just sugar-based caramel. Like all of these different complicated processes now really mask the ability to sense what's actually in the foods. A crazy implication of this that the researchers themselves mention from this scientific review I'm talking about today is that eating artificially low-fat or low-sugar foods could actually backfire and cause weight gain, because when you eat low-fat foods or low-sugar foods, you first, over time, will probably start to crave them less because your body will learn that they are kind of lying and they shouldn't taste as good as you think they do, because they actually do not predict high fat or high sugar or whatever they're supposed to taste like. So they are actually poor predictors of getting a nice hit of fat or sugar later on. And then a second reason why eating artificially low-fat or low-sugar foods could cause weight gain is that later, when you are eating the normal versions of those foods, you have now been trained to have to eat more of them to get 200 calories, for example. So if you're used to having to eat 100 grams of the low-fat food to get 200 calories of that food, then when you encounter the high-fat version, you'll still probably eat 100 grams, and it could be 2,000 calories instead. So you'll end up eating way more because you've been trained that you need to eat more of milk or soda or whatever in order to get your calorie fix. So whenever you're encountering the normal version, you'll end up eating much more. And I want to note that this does not apply to foods that are naturally low in sugar or low in fat or whatever, because first, as I said, when things are unprocessed, generally their taste will map on much better to what's actually in them. And for a second reason that I'm going to talk about next. And that second reason is that I think that all these post-ingestive effects also provide a pretty clear mechanism for how we learn to crave things and how we might be able to change our cravings to get ourselves to crave more healthy foods. And before this, I just want to add the caveat that it is going to be hard to compete with cravings for high energy density foods, because we just evolved to really enjoy things that can deliver a ton of calories very quickly in a very efficient way. But in addition to that, the caffeine studies I told you about also show us that we can crave foods based on non-calorie-based positive effects that they have on our body. So we can learn to crave coffee, even though it doesn't really have calories, just because it has caffeine in it. And it can make it taste good to us because we enjoy the physiological effects of caffeine. And I think that this effect could also extend to other positive effects from foods, like anti-inflammatory effects. So I would bet that if we learn over repeated exposures that a given food causes us to be less inflamed, then we will start to crave that food more. And foods that are known to cause lower inflammation are things like berries and legumes and whole grains and pretty much any vegetable, especially greens and cruciferous veggies. But when it comes to low-fat, non-sugary foods, there is no hyperpalatability or calorie density explanation for why we would start craving them more. But I know that a lot of people who start eating a whole food plant-based diet end up really craving those foods over time. And I am one of them. I much prefer to eat my usual whole foods plant-based foods than processed food that I used to find really delicious. So now I would crave a smoothie over a cake like 9 times out of 10 because a smoothie just sounds better and tastes better to me, probably because of the good effects it has on my body in the post-ingestive period. And now for the main takeaway of my theory that is a unique new thing you can try in your own life. I would bet that if you have anti-inflammatory foods in the context of crappy usual Western diet meals, like sticking some lettuce and tomato on a burger, or throwing some vegetables into an oily, egg-filled white rice stir fry, or throwing some berries into a cake, you will not get the boost of cravings for fruit and vegetables from that. Because if you're eating this meal that overall has negative effects on you, then you're not going to have an anti-inflammatory post-ingestive effect. You're not going to have good things happen to you that cause you to crave berries more, because you can't tease those effects apart. All your body knows is what happens to you after you ate this meal, not what the individual parts did. All it knows is the sum of what happened. On the other hand, I think that a much more effective way to get yourself to start craving healthy foods is to incorporate those foods into overall very healthy meals. So for example, if you want to start craving vegetables more, then I would put them into a meal that only contains other healthy ingredients like nuts, legumes, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, and seeds. Pretty much those are going to be your best bet all the time, unless you're allergic to any of them. So if you want to get yourself to crave something more or get something that tastes better to you, then I suggest incorporating it into a meal that contains only healthy foods, especially other ones that you already like. So things like Buddha bowls or smoothies or an oil-free stir fry that has whole grains instead of refined grains. Because when you eat these meals that are just healthy, you are going to get an actual anti-inflammatory effect and a very strong, beneficial post-ingestive effect on your body. Because when you're having just good things, you're just going to amplify the goodness of all of them essentially and help your body to learn that these foods, especially the specific meal you ate, is predicting good effects and therefore increase your cravings for them. But for another example that I've accidentally done in my own life is that you might be able to increase your cravings for a food by adding caffeine to that meal. For example, most mornings I have a smoothie that has berries, bananas, sunflower seed butter, and hemp seed. And lately I started adding matcha just because matcha is so healthy and I wanted a little more caffeine in the morning. And I definitely have been craving the smoothie even more than I was now that I think about it. So it seems like adding matcha, which is already a super healthy thing, it's green tea powder, to my smoothie may have even made the fruit and whatnot taste better to me, which I was wondering why it started tasting so much sweeter lately, even though matcha is bitter. So this might be why. So if you want to crave more fruits and have more smoothies, then adding matcha to it might help you to increase your cravings for smoothies. And this might be able to work by pairing coffee with a meal, but that does reduce iron absorption, as does matcha, so proceed with caution. So my theory here is that eating anti-inflammatory foods and foods that generally have very positive effects on your body is going to increase your cravings for them over time, but only if you eat those foods in a way where the entire meal, the entire eating episode is able to have a good impact on your body. So not just putting the good foods in a bunch of crap, because you're not going to get the good effects from that. So for the final nugget of takeaways from this video overall, I think that this data does suggest that avoiding artificial sweeteners might be a good idea. In general, your best bet is going to be to eat more whole foods and less processed foods, as we already know from so many different studies. And if you're not totally convinced of how effective avoiding processed foods can be for your weight, then check out another video I've made on studies looking at how processed versus unprocessed foods affect weight, and it's pretty crazy. So definitely check that out if you're interested. I hope you found these results as interesting as I did, and I hope these can be helpful for you. If you find my content valuable or helpful, then please consider supporting me in making these videos. If you're interested in bonus content, then head on over to my Patreon. And if you are interested in just making a one-time donation to support the channel, then head on over to my GoFundMe. I really appreciate all of you who have helped out here, and it means a lot to me. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please like and share it so other people can get this information and learn how our taste and cravings actually come about. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell below to stay up to date on all this science. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.